Have you ever wondered why some of the most extraordinary stories never make it into the history books? Welcome to 7 Continents, One Story.
So glad you're here with us today.
Yeah, this is literally my favorite place to be. Let's go.
I'm Celine, based in Edinburgh, Scotland. History hobbyist, library regular, endlessly curious.
I'm Nils, professor of history from Sweden. I've spent decades collecting these stories.
And I'm Ethan from Malta. I'm the one who always asks what happened in Japan.
Each episode, we travel together through time, across all 7 continents, to uncover a story that shaped the world.
We bring the history. Celine brings the questions that make you think differently about it.
And I bring the questions that make Niels slightly nervous.
The more we learn, the more we realize how much there still is to discover.
Right then, Celine, I have something I want you to identify. 2 objects, actually.
Oh no. What is it this time, Ethan? Last week's mystery took me 3 days to figure out.
These are not ancient, but they are old. They are precious, and they represent one of the greatest geographical disputes in the history of exploration.
Is this about Antarctica? We have not done Antarctica yet.
Niels, you are going to love this one.
Right, come on then. What are we looking at?
First, a medal, bronze and silver, struck in St. Petersburg in 1819. On one side, the profile of Tsar Alexander I. On the other, an inscription. Sloops Vostok and Mirny, 1819.
Vostok and Mirny? Those are Russian ship names, right?
Yes, exactly. These medals were handed out to commemorate one of the most important voyages in history. A voyage that the world still argues about today.
The inscription is about ships, so this is about a naval expedition?
The second object is a logbook. Handwritten, bound in leather, filled with navigation notes, sketches, coordinates. The handwriting is precise, the observations are meticulous, and this book contains the first recorded observation of a continent that the world believed was just myth.
Wait, are you talking about someone discovering Antarctica?
I am talking about 3 expeditions, 3 nations, 3 captains, all sailing into the Southern Ocean in 1820, all of them claiming they saw something that had never been properly documented before. And almost 200 years later, we still cannot agree who was actually first.
Let me take you there. The year is 1820. January, the southern summer, though you would not call it warm. Imagine a sailing ship. Wooden hull, canvas sails, not a motor, not steam yet, just wind and the skill of the crew. The ship is called the Vostok. It cuts through waters darker than you have ever seen. Black water, endless ice. The temperature is below freezing. On the deck stands a man named Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, a Russian naval officer, Swedish by birth, but sailing under the Tsar's flag. He is looking south, to waters that very few humans have ever navigated. And as the mist clears, he sees something. Something that looks like an impossibly tall wall of white. Ice. But beneath it, something solid, something vast, something that should not exist.
That is the Antarctic continent.
That is the question that will dominate this entire episode. To understand why this moment matters so much, we need to go back centuries. European mapmakers, ancient geographers, philosophers, they all believed something. There must be a great southern continent somewhere, a land to balance the northern continents. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land.
So they knew there was a continent there before anyone had ever seen it?
Not knew, believed, suspected. For thousands of years, it was pure speculation. Maps from the Renaissance show enormous southern continents drawn on them. But they were guesses. Educated guesses, perhaps, but guesses nonetheless.
That reminds me of something I was reading in the library. James Cook, the explorer, he sailed south in the late 1700s, correct?
Exactly right, Celine. Between 1772 and 1775, James Cook crossed the Antarctic Circle. He sailed further south than anyone before him.
So he found Antarctica?
He found ice. Endless ice. Dangerous pack ice. He concluded that if a southern continent did exist, it would be so hemmed in by ice that it would be worthless. So he sailed back north.
And for the next 40 years, no one really tried again?
For decades, nothing. Then in 1819, everything changed. 3 separate expeditions would converge on the Southern Ocean. 3 nations, 3 different purposes, all destined to make history, and all destined to argue about it for the next 2 centuries. The first were the Russians, led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen and his second-in-command Mikhail Lazarev. 2 ships, the Vostok and the Mirny. They were sent by the Russian Imperial Navy to explore the high southern latitudes and determine once and for all whether a southern continent truly existed.
So the Russians were basically on a scientific mission?
Imperial science, prestige. The Tsar wanted the Russian flag planted wherever possible, and he wanted knowledge. These expeditions served both purposes.
And the British?
The British sent Edward Bransfield, a naval master, Irish-born, but serving the Royal Navy. He was sent to survey new lands that had just been discovered, the South Shetland Islands, and to map this mysterious region.
And what about the Americans?
The Americans did not send an official expedition, but they sent a young man named Nathaniel Brown Palmer, a sealer, a merchant, someone hunting fur seals for profit. He was only 20 years old, sailing a tiny ship called the Hero, barely longer than a school bus.
So 3 completely different types of expeditions: imperial science, naval surveying, commercial sealing, all in the same place at the same time.
Converging on the Antarctic Peninsula in January 1820, and about to make history that the world still argues about today. Which brings me back to our medal and logbook. The medal I showed you earlier was distributed to the crew of the Vostok and the Mirny. Struck in silver for important people, bronze for the crew, each one commemorating this voyage.
How many of these medals were made?
Approximately 190, one for each member of the expedition. But here is what makes these so significant. They were made before the expedition left St. Petersburg in July 1819. The Tsar believed in this mission so completely that he had medals struck in advance. He was saying to his men, "You will do something so important that we are already commemorating it."
That is so cool. They were officially committing to the fact that they would make history.
Exactly, Ethan. These medals represent confidence, vision, ambition. The expedition would need all 3 in the months ahead. In July 1819, the Vostok and Mirny departed Kronstadt near St. Petersburg. Fabian Bellingshausen was no rookie explorer, but this voyage was different. They were sailing into the unknown, truly into the unknown. The expedition sailed south around Cape Horn. They discovered parts of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. By late January 1820, they had crossed the Antarctic Circle, the first expedition to do so since James Cook in the 1770s.
And that is when they saw something?
On the 26th of January, they crossed the Antarctic Circle. The next day, on the 27th of January, 1820, Bellingshausen observed something remarkable.
What did he see?
The logs describe an ice shore of extreme height. Coordinates recorded: 69 degrees 21 minutes south, 2 degrees 15 minutes west. About 20 to 32 kilometers from what we now know as the continental mainland, the Fimbul Ice Shelf off Queen Maud Land.
So he saw ice. Ice shelf ice?
That is the question that has consumed historians for 200 years. What Bellingshausen recorded as Maturoi Liod, Russian for hard ice, was almost certainly a permanent ice shelf grounded on the Antarctic continent. Not floating pack ice, not a temporary formation, a massive ice wall fixed to the land beneath.
But that still means he saw ice, not actual land with rocks and mountains?
Perfect question, Ethan. And this is where the real dispute begins. 3 days later, January 30th, 1820. Hundreds of miles away, a different ship, the British brig called the Williams, on board Edward Bransfield, Royal Navy Master, and William Smith, the merchant captain who had discovered the South Shetland Islands the year before. They sail southward from the South Shetlands, and as they push south, the mist clears, and they see something completely different from what Bellingshausen had seen.
What did they see?
Mountains, rocky peaks, snow-covered ridges. The journal of a young midshipman named Charles Pointer recorded their astonishment. Immense mountains, rude crags, and barren ridges covered with snow. The crew could see rock, actual continental rock, not ice, land.
So Bransfield saw something different than Bellingshausen?
Yes and no. They likely saw the same general phenomenon, the Antarctic Peninsula. But Bransfield saw the exposed Rocky Mountains at Trinity Peninsula. Bellingshausen had seen the ice shelf further south. Different regions, different first impressions, different interpretations.
And Bransfield charted what he saw?
Yes. Bransfield made detailed charts of the coastline. He described snow-covered mountains rising from the sea. He took possession of the land for the British Crown in the South Shetlands, and he claimed the coast he had seen. Cartographers later confirmed that what he had charted matched the actual coastline of Trinity Peninsula. His charts were accurate. His observations were reliable. Now, later that same year, months later, November 1820. A young man stands on the deck of a tiny ship called the Hero. His name is Nathaniel Brown Palmer. He is not a naval officer. He is a sealer, a hunter of fur seals. Born in Stonington, Connecticut, he is barely 20 years old.
A sealer? A teenager discovered Antarctica?
Palmer sighted the coast in November, well after both Bellingshausen and Bransfield. But his importance lies not in being first, but in being American and in being a commercial explorer. He was not sent by a government. He was hunting seals and happened to find a continent.
So what did he contribute if he was not first?
Confirmation, communication. He met with Bellingshausen the following year in 1821, and they exchanged information. Bellingshausen was impressed with Palmer's knowledge of the region and agreed to name the land Palmer had described as Palmerland on the Russian charts. So Palmer gave us the name.
And that is why we still call part of Antarctica Palmerland?
Precisely. This is where it becomes complicated, and this is why the dispute has lasted 200 years. Because the answer depends on what we mean by seeing Antarctica.
But seeing, is it not?
Not in this case. Consider Bellingshausen saw an ice shelf, a massive wall of ice, grounded on the continent. Modern glaciology confirms that this ice shelf is fixed to the Antarctic mainland, so he saw the continental margin. But he did not see exposed rock.
And Bransfield saw rock?
Bransfield saw mountains, rocky peaks, exposed continental crust. No ambiguity. These were clearly the actual rocky peaks of a continent.
So, depending on how you define discovery, either one could be first.
Exactly, and this is what has created the dispute. Modern Russian and international scholarship generally credits Bellingshausen with the first sighting of the Antarctic continent, meaning the continental margin, including the ice shelf. But British historiography often emphasizes Bransfield as the first to see unambiguous continental land, rocky mountains, not ice.
So who actually discovered it?
That is the wrong question, Ethan. The right question is, what counts as seeing a continent? And the answer depends on your definition. Which brings us back to our logbook. Bellingshausen's logbook contains meticulous entries, coordinates, sketches, observations about the ice, the weather, the phenomena they observed. He was a trained naval officer, trained in precision and observation.
Were his observations accurate?
Remarkably so. Modern cartographers have compared his coordinates and sketches with modern maps. What Bellingshausen described as an ice shore of extreme height at 69 degrees 21 minutes south, 2 degrees 15 minutes west, corresponds exactly to the seaward face of the Fimbul ice shelf. Not approximate, exact.
So his measurements were that precise?
In 1820, with instruments far less sophisticated than today, yes. The Russian Imperial Navy trained its officers in precision navigation. And this precision is exactly why Bellingshausen's observations are taken seriously today.
The logbook is the evidence.
The logbook is everything. In the absence of video or photographs, the logbook is our window into what he actually saw. What is interesting about this dispute is how it reflects national pride. Each nation has created a historical narrative that best suits its own interests.
What do you mean?
For much of the 20th century, Russian and then Soviet historians argued that Bellingshausen deserved sole credit for discovering Antarctica. They emphasized the precision of his observations, the scientific nature of his mission, the fact that he documented everything meticulously.
And the British?
British historians, particularly after 1925, began promoting Edward Bransfield. They highlighted the clarity of his sighting, rocky mountains, not ice. They emphasized that Bransfield saw unambiguous continental land. And they pointed out that Bransfield had been largely forgotten in favor of other, later Antarctic explorers.
So each nation rewrote the history to favor their explorer?
In a sense, yes. Not dishonestly necessarily, but selectively, emphasizing evidence that supported their claim.
But what is actually true?
That is the most honest question you have asked all episode. Let us look at the primary evidence, the actual documents. Bellingshausen left us detailed logbooks, officers' journals, charts, sketches, all preserved and studied. What they tell us is that on the 27th of January, 1820, the expedition observed what they described as an ice shore of extreme height at specific coordinates. This observation is consistent, detailed, and corroborated by multiple officers.
So multiple people saw it and recorded it?
Yes, the astronomer Ivan Simonov was on board. He made his own observations and kept his own journal. When Soviet historians in the 20th century re-examined these documents, they concluded that the hard ice, described in multiple accounts, was almost certainly a permanent ice shelf grounded on land. The evidence supports this interpretation.
What about Bransfield's evidence?
Bransfield's evidence is equally clear, but different. He left detailed charts of the Trinity Peninsula coastline. He described rocky mountains. Later, explorers verified that his charts matched the actual coastline. The Royal Navy corroborated his observations. When Bransfield charted the coast, he was charting actual continental rock, not ice.
So both sets of evidence are solid, but they describe different parts of Antarctica?
Exactly. Bellingshausen approached the continent from the south and saw the ice shelf face. Bransfield approached from the north and saw the rocky peninsula peaks. They were looking at different aspects of the same continent, hundreds of miles apart.
Wait, Niels, are we going to talk about someone who is forgotten by history? Someone important?
Ethan is right. Every episode should have an unsung hero. Let me think about this episode. Who deserves remembering?
What about the crew members? Nobody ever remembers the ordinary sailors who actually did the work.
Perfect. Let me tell you about the crews of these expeditions. 300 men across 3 ships, sailors and naturalists, officers and deckhands. They faced unimaginable conditions. On the Vostok and Mirny, you had around 190 men total. They were sailing in 18, 19, and 20, wooden ships, limited food, Arctic conditions. Many of them would never have seen snow before leaving Europe.
That sounds incredibly hard.
190 men in the most dangerous waters on Earth, in ships that were barely adequate for the task. The hull of Vostok was so weak that the crew was constantly patching it, strengthening it, fighting to keep the ship together. Multiple times during the voyage, water came through the hull. Multiple times, the ship nearly sank.
And they kept going?
They kept going because they believed in the mission, because Bellingshausen inspired them. Not all of them survived unchanged. Some suffered from scurvy, some suffered from the psychological effects of the constant danger. But they documented a continent. They made observations that would shape our understanding of Antarctica for 200 years.
Should we remember their names?
We should. We do not have space for all 190 in this episode, but I want to name a few. Ivan Simonov, the astronomer and naturalist aboard Vostok. Semen Zeleny, the artist who sketched Antarctic wildlife. Mikhail Novosilsky, a gifted navigator who helped plot the expedition's course. These men were not famous. History forgot them. But without them, Bellingshausen's observations would never have been recorded. Remember these names, remember the crew. Now, back to our medal and logbook. The final clue is this. These medals represent a statement of confidence by the Russian state. They were made before the voyage began. They anticipated success. Success they believed would be the confirmation of a continent.
And did the medals accomplish that?
When the Vostok and Mirny returned to St. Petersburg in 1821, Bellingshausen was celebrated as a hero. The Tsar decorated him. But the world remained uncertain. Because while the Russian expedition had observed an ice shelf, the British had observed rocky mountains. 2 different sightings, 2 different interpretations. And suddenly, the question of who discovered Antarctica became not a question of fact, but a question of definition.
So nobody really knew who was first?
Almost 200 years later, we still do not agree. But the medal and the logbook remain. These artifacts, held in museums in St. Petersburg and London, tell the story of 2 different moments, 2 different expeditions, 2 different interpretations of what it means to discover a continent.
Nils, you mentioned something earlier about uncertainty. Are there other claimants to discovering Antarctica?
Yes, there is a ship called the Spanish warship San Telmo. It was wrecked in the waters around the South Shetlands in 1819, possibly 1820. The ship went down in ice. If any of the crew survived and reached land, they would have been among the earliest people to set foot on Antarctic territory.
But we do not have documentation?
No, the San Telmo was lost. No crew survivors left records. So, while it is possible that Spanish sailors reached Antarctica before any of the documented expeditions, we cannot prove it. And in history without documentation, we cannot claim certainty.
So there might be a story we will never know.
Yes, and that is part of what makes history so humbling.
Wait, I want to know about the first person to actually walk on Antarctica, the first landing.
This is interesting. The first sighting is 1820, but the first landing? That is disputed too. A sealer named John Davis reported going ashore in February 1821, but historians disagree about whether he actually reached continental land or whether he stepped on an ice shelf. The distinction matters.
Because an ice shelf is not exactly land?
Technically, an ice shelf is floating ice attached to a continent. If Davis stepped on an ice shelf, is that discovering the continent? The answer depends, again, on your definition.
Why is everything about Antarctica so complicated?
Because Antarctica is complicated. It is ice. It is land beneath the ice. It is remote. It is mysterious. It defies easy categorization.
So let us think about this carefully. It is January 1820. I am a Russian naval officer aboard the Vostok. I have been sailing for months. I am in dangerous, uncharted waters, and I see something remarkable. An ice wall that appears to be attached to something solid beneath. You do not see rock. You see ice.
And you are the captain. What do you do?
Fabian Bellingshausen faced this exact decision. Do you report this as the sighting of a continent, knowing you have not seen actual land? Do you keep sailing and try to find rocky peaks? Or do you turn back because the ice is too dangerous?
What would you do if you were the captain of an expedition sent to confirm or deny the existence of a southern continent, and you saw this ice wall? Would you claim you had discovered the continent?
I want to hear everyone's opinion.
From a scientific standpoint, Bellingshausen did what any good explorer would do. He documented what he observed with precision. He recorded coordinates. He sketched what he saw. He noted that the ice appeared to be grounded on something solid. He was not claiming with absolute certainty. His language was careful. But he was reporting what he observed.
But did he see the continent? Truly see it? I mean, when I think of discovering a continent, I think of seeing mountains, seeing land, something you can put your feet on. An ice wall is not quite the same thing.
Okay, but here's my thinking. Modern glaciology says that ice shelf is attached to the continent. So technically, Bellingshausen saw the continent. It was just covered in ice. That still counts as seeing Antarctica, right?
This is exactly what historians debate. If we are strict about it, Bellingshausen saw the continental margin, the edge of the Antarctic ice sheet. That is part of the continent, geologically speaking.
But what if the ice shelf separated and drifted away? Would that change whether he discovered the continent?
Interesting. Ice shelves do exist over many decades and centuries. They do not usually separate and drift away. But theoretically, they could. Which suggests that what matters is not the ice itself, but the land beneath it.
So Bransfield was definitely 100% seeing the continent because he saw the land underneath?
Bransfield saw rocky mountains, rocky continental crust, no ambiguity. He was absolutely seeing the continental mainland.
So we have two moments that could both legitimately be called discovering the continent, but they are two different moments, two different aspects of the continent. Neither one is completely wrong. Neither one is completely right.
And this is why the dispute has persisted for 200 years, because there is no objectively correct answer. There is only the question of definition. So what did the explorers actually do? Fabian Bellingshausen continued sailing. He did not stay to try to prove definitively that land existed beneath the ice. His ship, the Vostok, was in terrible condition. The hull was damaged, the crew was exhausted. So Bellingshausen sailed on, reported his observations to the Russian authorities, and claimed success. He had seen the ice shelf. He believed it was grounded on land. He reported this to the Russian government, and for decades, the Russian claim to Antarctic discovery was based on his observations.
And Bransfield?
Edward Bransfield charted the coast of Trinity Peninsula. He made detailed maps. He took possession of the South Shetland Islands for the British Crown. He reported his findings to the Royal Navy. But at the time, his discovery did not receive as much attention in the world press as Bellingshausen's voyage. The Russians celebrated their achievement. The British celebrated their achievement. And the Americans, well, the Americans had Nathaniel Palmer hunting seals.
So 3 different celebrations, 3 different narratives.
3 different nations, 3 different reasons for exploration, 3 different moments in time, all in the same month, all claiming priority, all in some sense correct. Here is what most modern historians agree on today in 2026. Fabian Bellingshausen made the first recorded sighting of the Antarctic continental margin, specifically the ice shelf, on the 27th of January 1820. This sighting is now widely accepted by international scholarship as the first recorded observation of Antarctica. The Bellingshausen Sea is named after him. Russian stamps commemorate his achievement. Edward Bransfield made the first clearly documented sighting of exposed Antarctic continental rock, the Trinity Peninsula, on the 30th of January 1820. For those who define discovering a continent as seeing solid continental land rather than ice, Bransfield deserves first priority. British historians emphasize this. The location Trinity Peninsula commemorates his work. Nathaniel Palmer observed the Antarctic Peninsula coast in November 1820. While he was certainly not first, his contribution was significant for opening the continent to commercial exploration and for confirming the findings of the earlier expeditions. Palmer Land on the Antarctic Peninsula preserves his name.
So basically, nobody is entirely wrong and nobody is entirely right?
Exactly. This is history at its most fascinating. Not a simple narrative of discovery, but a complex, layered, multinational moment where the definition of what we are discovering matters as much as who discovered it. 206 years have passed since 1820. The Antarctic is still the most remote continent, still largely unexplored, still held in common by all nations under the Antarctic Treaty System.
What is the Antarctic Treaty?
In 1961, 12 nations, including Russia, Britain, and the United States, agreed that Antarctica would be reserved for peaceful purposes, that no nation could claim territory, that all nations could conduct scientific research. It essentially turned Antarctica into a shared commons for all of humanity.
So instead of the countries fighting about who discovered it, they agreed to share it?
Yes, and this is remarkable. The same nations that had disputed Antarctic priority for over a century came together and said, let us use this continent for science and exploration, not territorial conquest.
That is actually pretty cool.
From my Scandinavian perspective, I find the Bellingshausen story particularly compelling. Here was a Swedish-born man, from Sweden in the Nordic region, sailing under the Russian flag, commanding one of the greatest voyages of exploration. He brought Nordic precision, Nordic maritime tradition, Nordic attention to detail to this expedition.
So the Nordic approach to exploration was methodical, precise?
Yes, the Nordic navigators, Scandinavian sailors, had a reputation for careful observation and meticulous record-keeping. Bellingshausen embodied this. Even when he was cautious in his claims, he documented everything beautifully.
Is that why the Russians trusted him?
Partly, yes. Bellingshausen was appointed commander only 42 days before departure. There was no time to second-guess the choice, but the Russian Imperial Navy trusted that his Scandinavian training and precision would see them through, and they were right.
Here is something that fascinates me about this whole story. The South Shetland Islands were discovered by William Smith in February 1819. Less than a year later, the major continental sightings. Everything happened so quickly.
Yes. In just 12 months, the existence of the high southern latitudes as a viable exploration zone went from speculation to reality. And then, it took another century for serious exploration to begin.
Why did it take so long?
Because the Antarctic is incredibly difficult. It is far away. It is dangerous. The ice limits access. And unlike the Arctic, there were no indigenous peoples, no trading routes, no resources that made regular visits necessary. So, for most of the 19th century, Antarctica remained isolated. It was not until the 20th century, the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, that people started trying to actually reach the South Pole and explore the interior.
So the discovery was almost accidental?
In some sense, yes. These expeditions were not sent to discover Antarctica specifically. They were sent to explore the Southern Ocean. The discovery of a continent was a side effect. An incredibly important side effect, but still a side effect.
That is wild. One of the greatest geographical discoveries in history was almost accidental.
I want to end this act by thinking about why this dispute has lasted so long. Part of it is national pride. Each nation wants to claim a piece of history. But I think there is something deeper. The question of who discovered Antarctica reveals something true about how we understand exploration and discovery.
What do you mean?
Discovery is not a single moment. It is not a single sighting. It is a process, a layering of observations, a building of understanding. Bellingshausen saw an ice shelf. Bransfield saw rocky peaks. Palmer saw coastal features. Together, they created a picture. Together, they confirmed that Antarctica was real.
So they all discovered it together?
In a sense, yes. And this is more beautiful than any single nation narrative. This is how knowledge works. This is how exploration works. It is collaborative, even when the explorers are competing.
I like that interpretation better than the competing narratives.
Me too, Celine, me too.
So what did we learn today?
We learned that in January 1820, 3 different expeditions converged on Antarctica. The Russians, the British, and Americans all claimed discovery.
We learned that Bellingshausen saw an ice shelf and documented it precisely. Bransfield saw rocky mountains and charted them, and Palmer confirmed their findings.
And we learned that whether any of them discovered the continent depends entirely on how you define the word discovery. But there is something more important than the names of the commanders. It is the crew members who deserve remembering. Ivan Simonov, the astronomer who recorded observations with precision. Semen Zeleny, who drew what he saw. Mikhail Novosilsky, who navigated impossible waters. And 187 other men whose names we do not know, but whose courage made this discovery possible.
Remember the crew. Remember the ordinary people who did extraordinary things.
Remember the crew. This has been First Sighting Disputed, the story of 3 nations, 3 expeditions, and 1 continent that defied simple categorization. Antarctica remains one of the great mysteries of history, not because we do not know it is there, but because we still struggle to understand how we first came to know it. Until our next journey through time, keep history alive. Next week, we travel back to the ancient world. The year is 79 CE.
A volcano is about to erupt. Ash and pumice will bury an entire Roman city.
But in that destruction lies an extraordinary gift. A city frozen in time. Pompeii, a window into everyday life in ancient Rome.
And the story of a woman whose quick thinking may have saved lives even as the world ended around her.
I cannot wait for that one.